Deep beneath the murky waters of an Austrian lake lies evidence of one of history's most audacious economic warfare schemes. In 1945, as the Nazi Reich crumbled, SS officers frantically dumped printing equipment, copper plates, and millions of counterfeit British pounds into Lake Toplitz, desperately trying to hide the traces of a plot so dangerous it nearly brought Britain to its knees. This wasn't just another wartime deception. This was Operation Bernhard, a meticulously planned assault on the very foundation of British power, its currency, and it came terrifyingly close to succeeding. The story begins in September 1939, just weeks after Germany invaded Poland. While the world watched tanks roll across European borders, a different kind of warfare was being conceived in the shadowy corridors of Nazi power. SS officer Arthur Navy stood before his superiors with a proposal so bold it seemed almost impossible. Project Andreas, he called it. The plan was breathtaking in its simplicity and devastating in its potential impact. Flood Britain with £30 billion worth of perfectly forged banknotes. Drop them from aircraft across the British Isles. Watch as hyperinflation destroyed the pound sterling and brought the British economy to its knees. The concept wasn't entirely without precedent. Germany itself had experienced the crushing weight of hyperinflation after the First World War, when wheelbarrows full of worthless marks couldn't buy a loaf of bread. The Nazis understood the psychological terror of economic collapse, the way it could shatter a nation's will to fight before a single shot was fired. Hitler himself approved the operation, though not without ironic concern about whether counterfeiting might breach international law. The man orchestrating a campaign of unprecedented aggression across Europe worried about the legal implications of fake money, yet the strategic potential was undeniable. Britain's economy was the lifeline of its war effort, the foundation upon which Churchill's defiance rested. But there was a fundamental problem with the original plan. British banknotes in 1939 represented one of the most sophisticated printing challenges in the world, despite their deceptively simple appearance. These weren't ordinary pieces of paper. They were masterpieces of 19th century craftsmanship, virtually unchanged since 1855. Each note featured elegant black printing on white cotton rag paper, with the small but intricate image of Britannia in the top left corner. The paper itself was a closely guarded secret, manufactured with specific watermarks and textures that had taken decades to perfect. The technical challenges were staggering. Creating convincing counterfeits would require master engravers, expert printers, chemists who understood paper composition, and forgers who could crack the Bank of England's numbering systems. Where could Nazi Germany possibly find such expertise? The answer came from the darkest corners of the Reich's expanding network of concentration camps. As Project Andreas languished due to its technical complexity and the practical difficulties of aerial distribution over Britain, the concept lay dormant for nearly 3 years. The Luftwaffe, initially confident in its ability to dominate British airspace, found itself increasingly stretched thin. The massive airdrops envisioned by the original plan became logistically impossible as German air superiority evaporated over Britain. Then, in July 1942, Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the SS and overseer of Nazi Germany's most brutal operations, revived the scheme with a crucial modification. The new operation would bear the code name Bernhard, named after the SS officer who would lead it. But this wasn't simply a resurrection of the old plan. Himmler's vision was more targeted, more sinister, and ultimately more effective. Instead of attempting to crash the British economy overnight through mass distribution, the counterfeit pounds would serve a different purpose. They would finance German espionage networks, fund covert operations, and provide untraceable currency for intelligence activities across occupied Europe and neutral countries. The shift in strategy reflected both the changing realities of the war and a more sophisticated understanding of economic warfare. SS Major Bernhard Krüger became the unlikely mastermind of this operation. Krüger wasn't a typical Nazi thug. He was methodical, intelligent, and possessed an almost academic approach to the art of deception. When he inherited the remnants of Project Andreas, he found copper engraving plates and machinery gathering dust in abandoned offices. Some equipment was damaged, wire gauzes bent and unusable, but the foundation existed. Krüger's first challenge was assembling a team capable of producing counterfeits so perfect they could fool the Bank of England itself. His solution was as pragmatic as it was morally reprehensible. He would recruit his forgers from the concentration camps, selecting prisoners whose pre-war professions made them invaluable to the Reich's most secret operation. The recruitment process began with a systematic survey of prisoners across multiple camps. Krüger personally visited facilities, interviewing inmates with backgrounds in banking, printing, engraving, and graphic arts. These weren't random selections. Each prisoner was chosen for specific skills that would contribute to the operation's success. In September 1942, the first 26 prisoners arrived at Sachsenhausen concentration camp, about 50 miles north of Berlin. By December, 80 more had joined them. They came from 15 different nations and represented 55 distinct trades and professions. Most were Jewish, but career criminals with relevant expertise were also selected. The total would eventually reach 142 prisoners, all sworn to absolute secrecy under threat of immediate execution. Among these prisoners was Adolf Berger, a Slovakian typographer whose story would later provide one of the most detailed accounts of Operation Bernhard. Berger had been arrested by the Gestapo in 1942 for forging baptismal certificates to help fellow Jews escape persecution. His first wife, Gisela, had been murdered in the gas chambers at Auschwitz. When Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, selected Berger for the counterfeiting operation, he made a promise that would prove both true and false. Herr Berger, Höss had said, using the formal and respectful form of address rarely heard in concentration camps. "We need people like you. You'll be sent to Berlin. You will work as a free man, and I wish you every success." Berger later described his situation with dark clarity. "I always said I was a dead man on holiday." The prisoners assigned to Operation Bernhard lived in a strange limbo between privilege and terror. They were housed in blocks 18 and 19 at Sachsenhausen, isolated from the rest of the camp population for security reasons. Unlike other prisoners, they had individual beds with white sheets, civilian clothing, extra food rations, cigarettes, and even access to newspapers and radio broadcasts. The windows of their barracks were painted black to prevent observation of their activities. Inside, they had ping-pong tables and were allowed to organize amateur theatrical performances with mixed audiences of prisoners and guards. Krüger provided musicians for musical numbers, creating an almost surreal atmosphere of normalcy within the confines of a concentration camp. Yet beneath this veneer of improved conditions lay a constant awareness of their true situation. These prisoners understood that their lives depended entirely on their usefulness to the operation. Illness, failure to perform, or the completion of their work would mean immediate death. They were valuable only as long as they could contribute to the Reich's economic warfare against Britain. The technical challenges they faced were extraordinary. British banknotes weren't simply printed documents. They were complex artifacts requiring multiple specialized processes, each presenting its own obstacles to successful counterfeiting. The forgers began with the paper itself. Genuine British banknotes were printed on cotton rag paper with specific watermarks that had to be replicated with absolute precision. The prisoners experimented with different cotton fibers, chemical treatments, and pressing techniques to achieve the correct texture and feel. They discovered that authentic banknotes had a distinctive crispness when new in a particular way of aging that couldn't be rushed or faked carelessly. The engraving process presented even greater difficulties. The image of Britannia, seemingly simple, contained dozens of intricate details that required master craftsmanship to reproduce. Every line, every shadow, every curve had to be perfect. The prisoners worked with magnifying glasses and the finest engraving tools, spending weeks on single elements that most people would never notice. But perhaps the most challenging aspect was cracking the Bank of England's numbering system. British banknotes used serial numbers that followed complex patterns designed to prevent counterfeiting. The numbers weren't random. They contained embedded codes that bank clerks could verify against official records. Despite months of analysis, the German cryptographers never fully broke this system, forcing them to reuse serial numbers from genuine banknotes they had acquired. This weakness would eventually lead to their detection, but not before millions of counterfeit pounds had entered circulation. The quality of the finished products was extraordinary. Even Bank of England experts struggled to identify the forgeries. The counterfeits were so convincing that they're now considered among the most perfect ever produced. To give the notes an authentic feel of circulation, prisoners with dirty fingers would shuffle and handle fresh prints. Others would fold and crumple them slightly, Clerks would add typical British names or bank notations in pencil on the margins, mimicking the natural wear patterns of genuine currency. By late 1943, the operation was producing nearly 1 million counterfeit notes per month. The printing presses at Sachsenhausen ran continuously, churning out 5, 10, 20, and 50-pound notes with a combined value that would eventually reach 134 million pounds. This represented more than 10% of all British currency then in circulation. The distribution network was as sophisticated as the counterfeiting operation itself. SS Major Friedrich Schwend ran a special unit responsible for laundering the fake currency through clandestine channels. Bundles of Bernhard notes were smuggled into neutral countries including Switzerland, Sweden, and Turkey, where they were exchanged on black markets or used to purchase goods and intelligence. The counterfeit pounds financed some of the war's most significant covert operations. The famous double agent Ilyesa Bazna, codenamed Cicero, received suitcases full of British pounds for his espionage work in Ankara, unaware that most of the notes were forgeries. 100,000 pounds from Operation Bernhard helped finance the daring rescue of Italian dictator Benito Mussolini by German commandos in 1943. Nazi spies across Europe were paid with these perfect counterfeits, creating a shadow economy that operated parallel to legitimate wartime commerce. The fake sterling bought weapons, influence, and secrets throughout occupied territories and neutral nations. Meanwhile, British intelligence was beginning to notice disturbing patterns. The first detection came in September 1942, when a sharp-eyed Bank of England clerk noticed that a 10-pound note in front of him carried a serial number that was already recorded as withdrawn from circulation. The note had passed through a British bank in Tangiers, thousands of miles from where it should have been. As more counterfeits surfaced, the Bank of England realized the scope of the threat. Officials declared the forgeries the most dangerous ever seen. The quality was so high that standard detection methods failed. Only the most experienced bank employees could spot the subtle differences that marked these notes as fake. The British response was swift and decisive. Rather than risk widespread economic disruption, the Bank of England withdrew all notes with face values higher than £5 from circulation. This emergency measure effectively neutralized the immediate threat of hyperinflation, but came at enormous cost. Millions of pounds in legitimate currency had to be recalled and replaced, disrupting commerce and straining wartime resources. A special blue £1 note was issued in 1940, featuring metallic thread as an anti-counterfeiting measure. This was the first time such technology had been used in British currency, marking a permanent change in banknote design that persists to this day. As Allied forces advanced toward Germany in 1945, Operation Bernhard faced its final crisis. The prisoners and equipment were hastily evacuated from Sachsenhausen to Redl-Zepf in Austria, a subsidiary camp of Mauthausen-Gusen. Plans called for the operation to resume production, but the rapidly deteriorating military situation made this impossible. In the chaotic final weeks of the war, SS guards received orders to eliminate all evidence of the counterfeiting operation, including the prisoners who had created it. The forgers were to be transferred to Ebensee camp, where they would be murdered along with other inmates. But transportation difficulties and mechanical failures disrupted these plans. Only one truck was available for the transfer, requiring 3 separate trips. During the third journey, the vehicle broke down, forcing the remaining prisoners to march to Ebensee. When they arrived on May 4, 1945, they discovered that earlier groups of prisoners had revolted and refused to enter tunnels where they would have been killed. The guards had fled, and the delayed arrival of the final group inadvertently saved all their lives. As defeat became inevitable, SS officers frantically destroyed evidence of Operation Bernhard. Remaining counterfeit notes were burned, while printing equipment, copper plates, and unburned currency were loaded onto trucks and dumped into the depths of Lake Toplitz and nearby Lake Grundsee. The Nazis hoped the lake's depth would prevent recovery of the incriminating evidence. The operation officially ended with Germany's surrender, but its impact continued for decades. Between 1942 and 1945, over 8 million counterfeit British banknotes had been produced with a total value exceeding £134 million. Most of these notes had entered circulation through intelligence networks, making it impossible to track their ultimate impact on the British economy. The Bank of England didn't reintroduce banknotes larger than £5 until 1964, nearly 20 years after the war's end. Operation Bernhard had permanently changed British currency security, forcing innovations in paper, printing, and authentication that continue to evolve today. For the survivors like Adolf Berger, liberation brought its own challenges. Many prisoners were too weak to care for themselves after years of concentration camp conditions. The psychological scars ran deeper than physical damage. Berger later wrote extensively about his experiences, ensuring that this extraordinary chapter of wartime deception wouldn't be forgotten. The prisoners had lived with the constant knowledge that their survival depended on their usefulness to their captors. They had been forced to contribute their skills to an operation designed to undermine the very nations fighting for their liberation. The moral complexity of their situation defied simple judgment. Today, Lake Toplitz occasionally yields reminders of Operation Bernhard. Divers have recovered printing plates, machinery parts, and waterlogged bundles of counterfeit currency from its depths. These artifacts serve as tangible evidence of how close Nazi Germany came to achieving economic victory through deception rather than military conquest. Operation Bernhard stands as perhaps history's most successful counterfeiting operation, a testament to both human ingenuity and the depths of wartime desperation. It demonstrated that economic warfare could be as devastating as conventional military action, and that the tools of modern finance could become weapons in the hands of determined adversaries. The prisoners who made it possible paid an unimaginable price for their unwilling contribution to history. Their story reminds us that even in the darkest circumstances, human skill and creativity persist, even when forced to serve purposes their creators never chose.